WP-Get web dev tutorials for all user levels.
Both options. So there's a question here in Facebook from Laurie, and what she was wanting is this site here, this feature here where you roll over these columns and the background changes. What we figured out is they're using an unlimited elements widget for this, so you need unlimited elements plugin to do this. Probably others that do it, but that's the one that we've discovered they've used here. Now this does have, as you roll over, there's a bit of an animation for the background, but what I was looking at is whether you can do this without the plugins. So here's just a very quick example. So I've got 3 columns. If I roll over the mouse either any of these columns, the background changes. I haven't got any fancy animations. All I'm doing is changing the background of the outer container. I'm not changing the background of an overlay and then animating it. Could easily do that, but I'm just going to keep this very simple. So as you roll over, this background changes. So this tutorial is all about doing that. So if we head over to our page editor here, and I'm using containers. Doesn't matter how you do this. You can do it with containers. You can do it with sections and columns. It's entirely up to you. I'm just generally, when I'm mucking around for these tutorials, I'm just doing it with these containers. So what we have is an outer container. So this main container here, and I've just put some padding on the top and bottom so we can fill some space. And with that container, I'm just going back to the layout. It's set as a row, so it's horizontal, and it's boxed. I've added 3 containers inside that. Each of these containers I've just set to full width, so that every time I add one of these, it just takes up another column. That's pretty straightforward so far. Then I've just put a text box inside this, and in the container, I think itself, yes, I've got a 30 pixel padding just to give us something, some padding there. All right, now styling wise, I've got on my first container, I've got a background image, which for some weird reason it's not showing up in here, and just a color, center, and cover. And for my background overlay, I've just got a black with a 0.5 opacity. So that's pretty much my first image that will display. So if I do a refresh on this page here, the first image that displays is the one that I've set. Okay, so the inner containers here, so these 3 column containers, all I've done with those is in my styling, I've just put a background overlay of black with 0.21, could be whatever you like, as a opacity, and set the text in here the color of white. Now, the CSS with the outer container, all I've done is added a CSS class called container-hover-bg-change. That's the only class I need. All right, and for each of these columns, so we know which image to put on the outer container, each of these column containers here, so on those, if we go into the advanced attributes, I've created a attribute called data-bg-src pipe to separate the name of the attribute from the value, and I've just grabbed these relative paths to 3 images. So this one's got the the 161106 WebP, and this one here has another random number. So the only thing that's changed is same attribute, relative path to whatever image we want. So the JavaScript that we got is going to pull that attribute out, and it's going to set the background image of the outer container. So again, just one class here. The reason I've done as a class and not as an ID is so that we can have multiples of these all working off the one JavaScript. Okay, so the JavaScript, all I'm doing is setting my constant for my background container selector. So that's the class I set on this outside container here. Getting an array of all of those. So if we've got multiple of these containers with columns in them, we'll have an array, iterate through each of those elements, so each of these rows in effect, which I'm going to call the outer container. We don't need this because we're not using it, so I'm going to get rid of that there. Now, what I'm calling the trigger containers, the ones that are going to trigger the change, are all of these containers here that are inside that outer container. And what I'm looking for is just basically the outer container's children. So it's all the direct descendants. So these containers that are under the outer, that's all I want is the children. I'm going to create an array from those containers. Now, when you do any of these properties like parent, children, anything like that from HTML attributes or DOM attributes, I should say, it's not an array. It's what they call an HTML collection, which you cannot iterate with a for each. But there's an array utility, array.from the HTML container or HTML collection that creates an array, so we can iterate through it. So each of those, we get the inner container, and we're going to add a mouse enter. So when the mouse enters into that container, we want to get the image source from that container. And we want to take the outer container, so the main one, and we want to set the style for the background image to be a URL with the image source that we set in the data set. Now, just a note here. So see, I've got here image or IMG and then a capital SRC. So with attributes, if we go to this container here and look at the attributes, see, I've got BG SRC. That dash gets converted into a basically that. So we end up with BG uppercase SRC. So that is how JavaScript deals with those spaces. So my image source is my BG source. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. So image source is my inner container data set, BG source. So that is the same as the data BG SRC. Oops. BG IMG SRC. So that attribute there that I set on the container gets converted into a data set BG uppercase S lowercase rc. So that's what that converts to in JavaScript. Okay, so pretty straightforward. So every time we do a mouse enter into one of these containers, grab the URL that we set on that attribute and chuck that on the on the background image for the outer container. Can't get much easier than that. And so one other thing here is that because I've done this as an array and not using a ID, I'm using a class, I can duplicate this entire row here, for example, update that. And these, I'm just going to refresh this. And these are independent of each other. So see the top row, as I roll my mouse over, it changes to that image source, same as on the bottom row. And the reason that's doing that is because we didn't use IDs, we used class, and we got an array of these row containers here. So I'm going to chuck this into my tutorial so you can copy and paste this if you like. But yeah, it's just another way of being able to do this without having to use plugins. You know, I might actually make a supplementary tutorial to this on how you can actually animate those. What we'd have to do really though is we'd have to put the image source here onto an overlay container, and then we'd have to get an animation frame at the end of it. We'd have to make the background the same as the overlay, and then we can animate the opacity as it comes through. So there are ways to do it. I've just kept this nice and simple. So hopefully that's something that you find useful. And if you like this, please subscribe. Please hit the like button so that I know that you like it, and I can do more of this kind of thing for you.